Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on popping the bubble wrap, making space for risky play. My name is TJ Beemans, and I'll be your moderator. I am the Executive Director with the Saskatchewan Association of Recreation Professionals, and I am excited to be hosting today's session. I am pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Mariana Brussoni. Mariana is a developmental psychologist and associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics and the School of Population and Public Health at the University of British Columbia. She is an investigator with the British Columbia Children's Hospital Research Institute and the British Columbia Injury Research and Prevention Unit. Before I hand the mic over to Mariana, I have a couple housekeeping items about this webinar. First, this webinar will be available on demand after the live session and will be available through a link on our social media channels and website, sarponline.ca. Next, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have a question for our speaker, please feel free to send it through the question and answer tab at the bottom of your screen. Or if you're on a mobile device, the question tab should be on a drop-down menu. If we don't get to your question during today's session, we will be sure to follow up afterwards. Finally, I want to take a second and recognize our session partner, Saskatchewan in Motion. With great partners such as Saskatchewan in Motion, we are able to facilitate quality learning opportunities such as this. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Mariana Brussoni. Mariana, over to you.
Thanks, TJ. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you all for making the time to attend this webinar. Shortly, we're going to be cutting off the video, and actually what I'll do now is I'll share my screen so that, let's see, you can see my PowerPoint. Okay, here we go. Okay, so that looks good for everybody, TJ?
Yeah, that's good now.
Excellent. Okay, well, thanks again, everybody. And so just to, as TJ mentioned, I'm a faculty member at UBC and at BC Children's Hospital. And so just to give you a bit of background on kind of where I'm coming from and where this body of work stems from is I'm a developmental psychologist by training, but I've been doing injury research at the BC Injury Research and Prevention Unit since 2001. And so, but over time, what's happened is I've become kind of increasingly concerned about some of our best intentions around child injury prevention and keeping kids safe, particularly as it relates to children's recreation and outdoor play, and whether we're not considering some of their developmental and other kinds of needs for risk and risk-taking in play, and in fact, whether we might be potentially doing more harm than good in some cases. So that's where this this kind of body of work stems from. And so over the next little while, I just want to go over basically the what, why, and how of risky play. So what is it? Why is it important? I'd like to get, you know, a little bit of what you think. So it would be great if you could actually feel free to add your questions to the panel so that I can address them throughout, because while it's a webinar, it's hard to make it interactive. It would be lovely to hear your questions and your thoughts throughout. And then I want to move towards thinking about how to make change. And I hope that by the end of this webinar that you'll have some really concrete tools that address the specific needs that you have with respect to the kinds of changes you'd want to make in your practice. So, you know, I think it's really important for all of us to think back to our own childhood. So I'd like you just to take a few minutes right now. And think about your favorite childhood play experience. So if you kind of think back to, you know, where you were, what you were doing, who you were with, you know, and I really wanted you to think about kind of the sights and sounds that you had at that time to really take yourself back there to that experience. And so how many of you, you know, were outside? I'm guessing, based on what I've experienced in other presentations, that it would be most, if not all of you. And I would also guess that most, if not all of you, were also not in a traditional kind of playground or sports field, but you were in fact kind of in the streets around your home, or in forests, ditches, ravines, those kind of wild and leftover spaces that that we don't necessarily think of as playgrounds or places for children to play, but where children really find a lot of stimulation. I'm wondering if you took risks while you were engaged in that play experience. And I'm also wondering how many of you were supervised. And again, based on past experiences and some of the research we've done, I'm guessing that most of you were, or your companions were taking some risks, and that there was no adult around who was there to supervise or tell you what to do. Now, we've seen a bit of a shift in childhood, so that some children today, either you have your own children or the children you work with, are less likely to have those kinds of childhood memories where they could go out and, say, not come home till the streetlights came on, and be able to play in those kind of leftover spaces and have those experiences with their friends, you know, with endless hours of play in front of them. What we're seeing over time is that we're getting a shift towards indoor, sedentary, screen-based, supervised, organized activities. And it's actually, you know, the research is emerging in terms of some of the effects of that on children's health and well-being and development and so on. And I just want to touch on that over the next few slides. So one of the things we've seen, a consequence with this indoor screen-based activity, is that physical activity has gone down quite a bit. And so we have concerns around what that means for children's health and well-being, and the kind of obesity crisis that's going on right now. This is a slide showing it's 4 generations of one family. And the blobs indicate the roaming range for 8-year-old kids of that generation. And so, you know, starting in 1919 with the great-granddad who was allowed to go 6 miles fishing. That's the biggest blob you see on the screen. And then in 1950, you had granddad who was allowed to go about 1 mile into the woods. And then mom in 1979 was allowed to go about half a mile to the swimming pool. And then her son, who's 8-year-old today, is allowed to go to the end of his street. Now, these are data from Sheffield in England. But in fact, what we find is that for Canadian children, that in fact, they'd be lucky to get out of their garden gate. So we're definitely seeing a huge decrease in the roaming range of kids. So why should we care? Well, we're seeing changes in children's bodies. So for example, this research compared 12-year-old boys in 1981 and in 2007, 2009 on their body composition and their fitness levels. So they did boys and girls. And what they found was that Canadian children today are taller, heavier, fatter, rounder, weaker, less flexible, and less aerobically fit than they were in 1981. And while this research is now, you know, up to 10 years old, what we've seen is that that trend is actually continuing. In terms of, there's some interesting new research showing that it could also affect children's eye health. So we've seen an increase in rates of short-sightedness, or what's called myopia, over time. Researchers and ophthalmologists are actually uncovering that, in fact, some of this is due to kids not actually spending enough time outside, both in terms of kind of exposure to different light spectrums, as well as kind of looking off into the distance. And in fact, some ophthalmology researchers are suggesting that kids need 3 or more hours of daily outdoor time to impact their risk of myopia. We've also seen influences to children's brains. So there's been quite a huge increase in the rates of depression and anxiety over time. And some of that is that we've gotten better at measuring it. But some of that is actually also that in fact, it's increased. So for example, this chart shows using the exact same scale with college students in 1940 and 2009, or sorry, 2007, that you're seeing that in fact, college students in 2007 have rates of depression that would be commensurate with the psychiatric population back in 1940. In Canada, we have 1.2 million Canadian children and youth that are affected by mental illness in some way, shape, or form. And so we're going to talk a little bit later on about how, risky and outdoor play might impact this. There's also been concerns around changes in levels of creativity and creative thinking. And these graphs are rather complicated, but I'll just break them down for you. So basically using the exact same test across different time points, and the earliest point was 1974 and the latest is 2008. What we're seeing is that in fact that there's significant decreases in scores on different aspects of creativity since 1990. And that we're seeing the vast majority of those decreases happening amongst our youngest children, so kids in kindergarten and then in the primary grades. In Canada, we're also seeing 26% of our kindergarten children as developmentally vulnerable. And so, for example, when they're in kindergarten, they're vulnerable on communication skills and general knowledge, emotional maturity, physical health and well-being, social competence, and language and cognitive development. And so there's some big concerns around this and how we can kind of make sure that this number comes down for Canadian children. So I'm just going to switch tacks a little bit, and please feel free to ask any questions about any of that as we go along. But I want to talk more specifically now about risky play. So what is risky play? Well, this is what you see here is the definition that's been developed in the academic literature, and mostly by Ellen Sandseter, who's a Norwegian researcher who did her PhD work on this and really was the first person to kind of give a definition and provide some of the research around this. And so from her PhD thesis with kids, 3 to 5 years old, they talked about feeling this kind of scary, funny feeling, thrilling and exciting. And so the definition is thrilling and exciting forms of play involving uncertainty and the chance of physical injury. And so I just want to break down each part of this definition for you because it's important as a whole as well as each of the component parts. So with thrilling and exciting play, it's the kind of play where kids feel like that they're pushing themselves and they're trying something new and they're experimenting with the world and their body, and not so far that it's scary, but far enough that they get that kind of thrill, the tickle in the tummy. And if they know what's going to happen, it's not thrilling and exciting. So there has to be some exposure and some element of uncertainty to the experience so that they're experimenting, they're seeing how things work. And there is the chance of physical injury. Of course, there's a chance of physical injury. And so, we're going to talk a little bit more about that a bit later on in this presentation. So there's 6 different kinds, and actually 2 more added recently, of risky play that have been outlined in the literature. And so if we just run through each of those, the first kind is play at speed. So it could be, like these kids going down a really fast slope, going on bikes really fast, a really game of tag or something like that. Just kids feeling their body moving through space at speed. Play at heights is another kind. So whether that be trees or other climbing structures. Play with dangerous tools. So whether they're building forts or trying to do other sorts of things with hammers, nails, knives, whittling, those sorts of things would all be considered risky play. Play near dangerous elements. So fire, water, cliffs, those sorts of things would all be considered dangerous elements. Rough and tumble play. So play fighting or that kind of rough play is also a kind of risky play. Play where there's a chance of getting lost. So this means that kids can wander around their neighborhood with their friends or alone and really explore where they're going. And for younger kids, it can be, for example, hiding behind some bushes in a play space, you know, where they feel like they're off alone, and their caregivers might know exactly where they are, but they feel like they can get away and they're hidden in a little hidey hole. The two more recent kinds of risky play that have been outlined is play with impact. So, you know, feeling that impact, you know, in toddlers, for example, you often see that they'll be on say on a tricycle and they'll just slam into a wall kind of over and over again. Or some kids will grab kind of sticks and they'll bang them against the ground, and they'll want to feel that kind of vibration going up their arm. Or like this child in this photo, just kind of feeling the impact of the water. The final kind of risky play is vicarious risky play, and particularly for younger kids. You know, you can see when they're watching peers or older peers engage in kind of risk, this kind of vicarious feeling of thrill from that experience. And so what's important to really understand about risky play is that it looks different for different kids. So you can have kids who are the same developmental stage, the same age, etc. But when they're, that one of them, say, might be comfortable to go right to the top of a tree, whereas another one just wants to go to the first branch. And it's not up to us to decide what's risky or not. It's really up to us to give them the physical and the psychological space where they can explore these issues for themselves without us having to set unreasonable limits. Okay, so we just have a question from Shelley. I've been told quite a few years ago that kids instinctively know their own limits and will back off when the risk exceeds their comfort levels. Is there any research supporting or not supporting this comment? Yeah, and Shelley, I would say that that's exactly what we do see. That when kids are given the opportunity to explore those limits, that they get pretty good at figuring that out for themselves. And too often, we stop them kind of in their tracks. We say things like, stop, watch out, be careful. And not realizing that what they're experiencing when they hear these things is, I'm not capable and competent of taking care of myself. The world is too dangerous for me, and that I need an adult to figure this out for me. And so we're eroding their own sense of being able to do that, their executive functioning skills in terms of being able to kind of test these things out, and their risk management skills. So we'll get into some of the research a bit later on. And Shelley, if you feel like I haven't answered your question, please loop back, and we can get into some of the specific research that shows this. In terms of what risky play is not, it's really not an excuse for neglect or recklessness, unnecessarily promoting hazards. And it's also not about pushing children beyond their abilities or interests. So for example, as this topic has gotten more and more popular, I've had more and more kind of parents come up to me and say, how can I get my child to take more risks? How can I get them to make sure that they're actually getting opportunities for risk? And I see this as just as problematic as kind of the no and stop and be careful. because then you're really pushing them beyond their comfort zone, you know, the point at which they're ready. And that's where you can actually promote some hazards. And so, you know, as much as possible, we need to take ourselves out of the equation so that kids are able to make these decisions for themselves. And I have a video a bit later on, which I hope will illustrate some of how that's done. It's sometimes helpful for people to think about the difference between hazard and risk. So with a hazard, we have something where perhaps the child can't recognize the problem or can't manage the problem, like broken equipment or needles on a playground, or say, you know, a tree that, you know, is getting too old or too thin for their weight. And versus a risk where kids can decide for themselves whether they want to engage in that opportunity. So it's not to say that we should limit them from hazards. We can't take hazards out of the environment. It's impossible, and it's not even desirable. But what we can do is, you know, in the case of broken equipment, of course, we want to deal with it. But we also want to give kids the, you know, talk through with them some of the skills to manage these hazards themselves. You know, so for example, hey, what do you think about that tree? Do you think that, you know, how big do those branches look? So that you can actually get them to start thinking about some of that risk management themselves. So in terms of the approach we take in injury prevention, we talk about an as safe as necessary, not as safe as possible approach. We're not trying to prevent every little injury, nor can we realistically take away every risk or hazard, nor should we want to. We want to be able to manage those hazards that are the most significant, that are the most kind of likely to lead to very serious harm, as much as we can, but then be able to have kids explore risk as they feel the desire to. So what are some of the benefits of outdoor and risky play? So if I take you back, sometimes what's helpful is to think back to your favorite childhood memory. You know, and if you think about you, and I'm assuming, you know, based on what I've heard in the past, but, you know, if you were outside, why were you outside? You know, what is it about being outdoors that is just so much more interesting and compelling than being inside? Well, we know that play outside is actually different from play inside. And so we have kids who are, you know, you're able to move around more and make, you know, big movements with your body, run and climb and do things you couldn't do indoors. You can yell and shout. You have a sense of freedom, you know, because there aren't adults there restricting everything you do or telling you to use inside voices. You can play with your friends and hang out and figure out what the rules of the game are and how to adjust those rules for as you change your interests or for different players. You can experience the wind in your hair and the sun on your face and you know, all of those things that aren't necessarily, that are much harder to get indoors or impossible to get indoors. And so if you think through some of those things in terms of the developmental potential for them, then it makes complete sense why this kind of play is so important. So when you have kids who are creating their own rules, figuring out their own conflicts, and getting ensuring that they're managing those relationships, well, that's pretty amazing for socio-emotional development. It's also really important for executive functioning, so their brain and cognition skills. So figuring out what their goals are, the different steps to attain those goals, maintaining their attention so that they can, you know, move those goals forward. The physical movements, so fine and gross motor movements, and the physical literacy that they can develop from those experiences. We know that kids outside are more physically active than kids indoors. And then in terms of mental health, there's a number of important aspects to why this kind of play is so important. So with respect to risky play specifically, there are some very kind of normal phobias that develop as kids grow. So for example, you know, if you've had a 12-month-old in your life, you probably notice that that's about the time at which kind of separation anxiety peaks. And it's also very common to have, you know, some fear of heights and even fear of water. And these are actually, you know, evolutionarily kind of normal phobias. But what happens kind of normally is that children get gradual exposure to things that challenge these phobias so that they can extinguish them. So, you know, being increasingly away from their parents, climbing that little bit higher and higher and higher, or whatever the case may be, they're able to kind of have these experiences where they conquer these phobias and are able to realize that they're actually quite capable and competent of doing these things. And so this is really important kind of play for reducing anxiety. It's also important in the sense of kind of feeling a sense of self-confidence and resilience. And then I'll talk also about the outdoors and nature in a moment and the mental health effects of that. But essentially, I mean, what we've seen is that play is the engine of optimal child development. And so we really need to save space for this kind of play so that kids can engage in the kind of play they want to engage in. And with respect to, you know, my public health and injury prevention colleagues, I also point out that this kind of play is really important for risk management skills. So essentially, that keeping kids safe means letting them take risks. That through these experiences, they get a sense of how the world works and how their body works and how they can keep themselves safe. So I would want my child, for example, to figure out that pavement is slippery when wet, you know, on their bike and not the first time they get behind the wheel of a car. So in terms of kind of nature itself, access to nature is increasingly found as more and more important. And so nature is great for promoting change and challenge. So one of the things that people talk about their outdoor play memories and why that's so important is because outside changes all the time with the seasons, but even from one day to the next as things move around and sticks and stones are available or more or less of them or those sorts of things. So it's a wonderful opportunity to actually have really great variety and affordances for play outside. More and more research is pointing to the stress buffering effects of play and the attention restoration effects. So, you know, I'm sure many of you might be familiar with, you know, the experience of having had a really difficult day and being utterly exhausted and going for a walk in nature. It could be even just a bit of nature and kind of feeling yourself perked up and more relaxed. And also better able to manage your emotions and self-regulation. We also know from the research that exposure to nature as a child and the experiences we have with nature as kids really impact our environmental awareness as adults and our sense of why it's important to preserve our environment and live sustainable lifestyles. So there's been research with kids in Canada where they ask them what it's like to grow up in Canada and how we can make it better. And what I find remarkable is that the favorite thing about being a kid in Canada, the response they heard more often was playing outside. And so what this means to me is that, you know, screens are very compelling, but so is the outdoors. And so this is kind of a way to manage some of the, you know, promote health and development of children giving them the opportunity to do something that they actually love. And so it's not something you have to force them to do. They actually want to play outside. We just have to create the conditions where we provide them with interesting and stimulating outdoor play environments and don't quash that kind of play. So there's been quite a lot of concern about kind of the decrease in opportunities for play. And even a discussion about a silent play emergency. And the reduction of outdoor play and the opportunities for risk-taking has also been noted in Canada by some government agencies, NGOs, and the public health system. So for example, in 2015, we worked with Participaction to, as part of their report card on the physical activity of children and youth, to release a position statement around why this kind of play is important, and to, you know, bust some of the myths around why it's so dangerous and that sort of thing. And so you can see kind of the first page of the position statement here, and the next page is recommendations. But essentially it says access, here I'll put it in here, access to active play in nature and the outdoors with its risks is essential for healthy child development. We recommend increasing children's opportunities for self-directed play outdoors in all settings, at home, at school, in childcare, the community, and nature. And so I would welcome you to go to the URL you see here to see the position statement for yourself, and to also, if you're interested, sign on as a signatory supporting it. But one of the things the important things that came out of the release of this position statement, and there were actually many kind of positive knockoff effects, but one of them was that last year, the Council of Chief Medical Officers of Health, so this is all the chief medical officers of health from every province and territory in Canada who sits around this table, released their own position statement supporting ours. And so this is pretty important because, you know, this is the public health infrastructure recognizing the importance of kids getting out and being to play with risks in the ways that they want. And so it's been kind of interesting to see the knockoffs of this position statement, and I think that there's more and more and more coming. And for those of you who are interested, I would also point you to the Canadian Public Health Association website. They released a position statement recently, so I will actually later on show you where you can find that. Okay, so what are we afraid of? Why is it so hard for us to let kids play outside? And I'd love to get some comments on the comment board if you can type a few in. What are we afraid of? I'm just going to take a drink while you do that. Whoops. Let's see. Parent shaming, thank you. Bad guys, strangers, being different, strangers. Yeah. What else are we afraid of? Injury, absolutely. Any particular kind of injury we're most afraid of? Or say mechanism of injury? You think about why parents won't let their kids out to play. Whose responsibility is it? My community association didn't want to support neighborhood play because it wasn't their role. Yeah, so this kind of, diffusion of responsibility and finger pointing. Kidnapping, I'm guessing, is that one. Yeah. Yeah. Regarding the injury comment, it could be anything from injury to limbs to concussions, etc. Yeah, absolutely. But there's one particular kind of cause of injury that parents are more afraid of than any other cause, and why they won't kind of let their kids out, in the neighborhood. Any guesses what that is? Okay, we have launched a play program, informal meetups, loose parts, and nature play, and parent ed sharing sessions. Oh, awesome. Yes, cars, exactly. Parents are very afraid of cars. Yeah, and kidnapping, yeah. So I just want to run through some of the stats around that, so that you have a sense of how realistic these fears are. In Canada, the risk of kidnapping by a stranger is approximately 1 in 14 million. And so just to give you a sense of what that means, that's the same odds of winning Lotto 649. And in fact, it's been estimated that you'd have to leave your child outside alone for 200,000 years before their number came up, so to speak, and they were kidnapped by a stranger. So this is an extremely rare event, even though the perception is that it is a lot more kind of common than it is. When we do see Amber Alerts and things like that, inevitably it's a non-custodial parent or someone known to the family. It's not the white van man. Now, when I tell parents this statistic, it's an important statistic. It's impressive, but they still say, okay, but there's one. What about that one? So it really is quite an overwhelming fear for parents, regardless of kind of the lack of likelihood of this happening to their kids. So let's have a look at injury rates in general. So this is the Canadian mortality rates for all unintentional injuries for ages 0 to 19 years from 1950 to 2009. So what do you notice here? And yes, so traditional and social media scares the heck out of us. Yeah, there's a lot of social media around kind of kidnapping happening. And we feel like it's these dangers are just around the corner. So what you'll notice here is that, of course, it's injury rates that are an all-time low. And it's never been safer to be a child in Canada than it is right now. And so what do you think? What do you think is causing this decrease? If you can just throw out some ideas on the panel. We're not letting kids out to play. Maybe lack of unsupervised play. So overprotection is working. We're actually seeing a drop in injuries. Better sports equipment. So you'll see that there's kind of a fairly steady injury, like a small decrease until about 1972-ish. And then we see kind of this going down and down and down. Less physical activity, yeah, perhaps. But in fact, so any guesses what happened around 1972, 1973? Any guesses? Seatbelts, yes, exactly, seatbelts. So in 1973, I think it was, seatbelts became mandatory in cars. And then starting in, I think, 1975, if I recall correctly, provinces started passing seatbelt laws. And the last province to pass a seatbelt law was in 1990. So what you see here is mostly the effect of car safety. And so it was seatbelts, it was daytime running lights and things like that that really brought things down. So the leading cause of death in 1950 for kids was cars. Now, the leading cause of death in 2009, and again, even now, today, is still cars. Now, it's not kids as passengers, or sorry, kids in as pedestrians, it's kids as passengers. So it's children in cars who that's the most likely cause of death for kids, okay? Play, well, let's talk about play and the injury and death rates from play. So I found some stats around the deaths from falls from play equipment for ages 1 to 14. So I was able to find Canadian stats for 2007 through 2013. And for falls from trees from 2000 to 2013. So this is all across Canada. So 7 years of data represents, there's about 7 million kids in Canada age 1 to 14. So it's about 49 million kids that we're talking about, represented by 7 years of stats from falls from play equipment. And about 98 million kids represented in the data from falls from trees. So how many deaths do we see as a result of these issues across time? Almost nothing. Almost nothing. So what I guess I want to really highlight to you here is that the leading cause of injury, death for kids is cars. It's not play. Play has not really ever been a major cause of injury, death for kids. And yet we have this perception that it is so unsafe. Now, what we don't have in terms of these data is kind of an exposure. We don't really understand kind of the amount of time that kids spend doing an activity and how likely it is to lead to a medically treated injury. So there was a systematic review that was done in 2014 that looked across the literature. So all of the research studies that would have collected data on the amount of time that kids 6 to 12 spent doing these 3 activities, so active commuting, sports participation, and play, and how many medically treated injuries they ended up with. And so across these different studies, the definition of medically treated injury varied very widely from, say, going to get an ice pack, for a bump or a bruise, to actually having to go to the hospital to get something treated. So what we find when we look, so active commuting would be things like walking or cycling, say, to school, sports participation and play. What we find is, in terms of the greatest number of injuries, that would be play. But in terms of once you control for the amount of time spent doing the activity, that sports actually has the greatest likelihood of injury. And so this is the breakdown that came out of that systematic review here. And so you can see that sports at 0.20 to 0.67 medically treated injuries per 1,000 hours had the highest rate. Play was quite far down the list at 0.15 to 0.17 per 1,000 hours. And so just to give you a sense of what that means, a child would need to play for about 3 hours a day for approximately 10 years to log enough time to get one medically treated injury, which is likely to be minor. And so from an injury epidemiology perspective, our concerns around play aren't really justified. There are much more serious and significant causes of harm for kids. That, the primary one being cars and being a passenger in a car. And so it's rather ironic that, we put kids in cars and we drive them around in an effort to keep them safe, when in fact that is the riskiest activity that we could expose them to. Any questions about injury statistics? I'll just pause for a moment while I take a drink. Okay, well, feel free to ask them as we go forward. So I just want to talk a bit about how we make things better. So how is it that we can change things so that we give kids more freedom to play and to play in the way that they want to play? So there's three key ingredients to an outdoor and risky play supportive environment: time, space, and freedom. And so in terms of time, it's really giving them the time for unstructured, independent, and freely chosen outdoor play, not something that's directed by us, telling them how or what to do. And so, it could be, making sure that kids aren't overscheduled, or in the context of, say, school or summer camps or early childhood centers, that we make sure that they're outside every day, regardless of the weather. That we ensure that there's the appropriate clothing available for them to be able to be comfortable outside. But there's really little excuse why kids can't be outside every day. In terms of space, we really want to make sure that there's high quality and diverse spaces, that there's sufficient space, although even small spaces can be very stimulating for kids if we have limited room. One of the best ways to make a space kind of stimulating and interesting, that's actually extremely cheap, if not free, is to include loose parts. So things like sticks, sand, mud, water, tarps, bins, cloths, things that they can really take and mold and shape to whatever they're interested in. So I just want to show you a couple of pictures from research that we did, just to show you kind of how simple this is and how it doesn't actually have to be that expensive. So we did an intervention with a couple of childcare centers with very kind of poor outdoor play space. So the picture you see here on the left was one of the centers beforehand. And so it was essentially a concrete pad. There's a big chain link fence around it, and kind of some plastic toys thrown out on the playground, and that was about it. And the kids had tricycles, and really the early childhood educators spent a lot of time trying to keep the kids stimulated and sharing and you heard a lot of crying and so on. So on the right, you can see one of the pictures in terms of that, that same space and what we did. So, brought in some plants and some bamboo, created some interesting stenciling for them to follow, softened the space with some grass. There you can see more before and after pictures. So brought in kind of plants that they could have hidey holes and interesting textures and so on. And we actually, I'm happy to share this research study. The reference actually is at the bottom of here, but we found, significant impacts on children's a variety of kind of health and well-being outcomes for the kids, even with a very simple intervention. Here's some more kind of before and after, or sorry, after pictures. So, and there's lots of examples across Canada of some really great stuff. And I'm going to share with you a resource later on where you can find more information. So the last key ingredient is freedom. And the biggest issue around freedom is our attitudes. We are the problem. Our fears, our anxieties really get in the way. And so some of the most important things that organizations can do is to create supportive play policies and culture. And this really, ideally requires kind of a very thorough and thoughtful process where, for example, like Calgary developed a play charter for the city, but schools and early childhood centers or recreation providers are actually taking some time to think about their stance on play, the children's right to play, and what that looks like and how it's operationalized throughout their society, their particular culture within the organization. And again, I'm going to point you to some resources to help with that, because this has been done already. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. So you can get a sense of how it's been done and how it's been effective in other organizations. So one of the tools we've created to shift adult attitudes is one for adults, for parents. You can find it at outsideplay.ca. We just finished the randomized control trial on this tool, and it does work. It doesn't fix everything, of course, but it does start getting parents thinking about these issues and moving them along the continuum for change. So, this is a tool you can send the parents that you work with to, or look through yourself to get yourself thinking about some of these issues in your own practice. So essentially it takes parents through kind of a 3-stage process of kind of self-reflection questions where they can really think about these issues and how they see them as a priority and make a plan for change. In terms of supervision, so this is kind of hot off in fact, it's not in press yet. This is a diagram for, we have an upcoming risk-benefit assessment framework toolkit that we're going to be releasing in September. And this is one of the components of it. But I thought it might be helpful because I get a lot of questions of what should appropriate kind of supervision or care look like. And so you can think about it kind of as 3 different processes. So most of the time, you should be in open observation mode. So, this particular slide or icon was created in the context of caregivers, say in schools or early childhood centers, but it is also applicable to parents or others. The idea is that you are not intrusive. There's a trusting and caring interest in what the child is doing, an understanding and a coming to the child as a competent person rather than someone to be controlled. And so you're just kind of interested in what they're doing and considering their play in that context. And this is the bulk of the time, by far. Then maybe there's some warning signs. Maybe play and risk escalates. Maybe a kid wants to climb a tree, or whatever the case may be. And so maybe you have to recognize your own fears too. Maybe you're nervous about kids climbing tree, and it's okay to acknowledge that, right? So it's like a check-in. Hey, makes me a little bit nervous for you to climb that tree. How about, we think about what that's going to look like. And maybe, what do you think? Maybe go partway up the tree, but show me what you can do. So those kinds of gradual, because it's also an understanding that it's your own fears and anxieties that have to be dealt with, not only, the child's safety. So they may be perfectly okay doing that, but it's also you getting familiarity with that child. And one of the most important aspects of this is really the relationship with the child and your knowledge of that child. So this process is going to be easier the more you know that child. If you're in a situation where, kids are, say, dropping into an event or something and you don't get an opportunity to really understand them, then you're going to be a bit more cautious around what kinds of activities are going to take place. So let's say you can have a dialogue and a reflection with this focused attention where you're actually, getting them to think through some of the risk management and show you what they're capable of. So let's say, that it's something kind of critical that you need to intervene, say, a toddler running into traffic or whatever, you're going to step in right away. Or, if you feel like it's getting too far and you need to tone it down, then you're going to take immediate change. That's the active intervention. Your steps to reduce the risk, but you're going to maintain that empowering language. It's, again, not about control. It's about really helping them to help themselves, right? And so that should be the least amount of time that you're doing in terms of your supervision. And so it may be that you never get to that stage, and that's perfectly all right. So I wanted to show you a video now so that you can see kind of this type of supervision in action. So here's, oh, is it not going to work? Oh, it worked earlier. Let's see. Oh, I've got the swirly of death. Okay, let's see. Is it working? Oh, now I'm sad. Okay, well, just to give you some context while it's deciding whether it's going to work or not, this is in Anji, China, ANJI. And there's been a very interesting movement there around play and how they approach caregiving and early childhood education. And so these kids are in a childcare center in Anji, China. And the equipment you see here, the loose parts, were set up by the children. So they decided where they wanted those items to go and how they wanted to place them. And if we were able to see this video, what we would see is the series of girls kind of crossing across this plank. And it's kind of interesting because the kids shift the fulcrum of that plank based on their comfort level. So some of them shifted in closer, some of them shifted in further that way. You can see that there's girls here who are holding, recognizing the weight of their companion, they're holding, they're figuring out and changing the level that they need to hold on to here as the children play. And this is constantly shifting. It's too bad we can't see the video because you can see basically constant risk management happening as these kids are exploring. And back behind here, behind the girl in the green pants, is the early childhood educator. And what she's doing is she's basically taking a video of the events. And what they do with those videos is afterwards, they'll actually curate the videos and they'll show them to the children. They're select videos to show so that they can have a discussion around the, hey, what were you doing here? And, and so it actually deepens the pedagogy of that particular experience. But I was hoping that we could play out this video so you could see the early childhood educator's reaction to this. So she basically is quite, removed from the situation. There's one point that she kind of steps in to create extra weight to balance the fulcrum. But other than that, she kind of lets it all play out. Oh, well, there we go. Yeah, I can show you kind of different parts of the video. Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, you're not going to get to see it. But if you go to Anji Play, they have a Facebook page, ANJI. They have a website. You can see some of these videos for yourself. Let's see if we can get something else. You can see how there's kids kind of moving around with ladders and stuff because there's kids moving to other sections, getting things happening. Okay, so one of the kind of rules that I give to, let's see, are we going to be able to advance forward? I think we're stopped here. Okay, so for those kind of that are having a hard time kind of figuring out where to start, one of the things that I tell is maybe you should try the 17-second rule. And essentially what that is basically to just, the next time you have that temptation to say stop or be careful or step in any kind of way, just actually count to 17 seconds to let the situation play itself out a bit more so that you can get a sense of what those kids are comfortable with, how they're going to manage the situation themselves, and then be able to give them the opportunity to do that. In terms of other resources, so I mentioned kind of at a few different points a resource I was going to share with you. This one is really fantastic. So it's the Canadian Public Health Association, and they developed a toolkit to support unstructured play. And this is what it, how you get into the toolkit and the different elements of the toolkit. So we have infographics, which are really simple and great infographics that say you could use for parents you work with or for advocacy, to kind of give some information to people in your organization that you need to convince around why this kind of play is important, busting some of the myths around injuries and so on. So they've kind of done that work for you, and you should feel free to take those and print them out or email them or whatever. They're freely available. The promising practices provide examples of practices throughout Canada where some different kinds of ways of promoting outdoor and risky play have been tried. So you can see what some people have done and what, get some inspiration or get a sense of some of the things you could learn from. The research summaries provide kind of the state of the evidence, and there's a few different kind of sources of research summary, but that would be a really good one. And they're written in language that's kind of lay language to really be accessible to a public audience. There's lots of wonderful decision-making tools, so I really encourage you to look through that section. So, for example, there is a tool there to help figure out how to, say, create a play charter or some sort of structure for your organization and how you want to approach play. There's a loose parts management tool, to give you a sense of the kinds of things you need to figure out and put into place. There's a tool around kind of risk and liability issues, so it gives you a sense of the legislative context and a whole bunch of other goodies in there that I would really encourage you to go and have a look at. I would also say, and eventually it'll be looped into this tool, as I mentioned, we're developing a risk-benefit assessment framework, and that will be released at the end of September at the Outdoor Play conference, and I'll give you a link to how to find out about that. And so, kind of watch this space, because that's going to be a toolkit that will allow practitioners and others to really think about risk-benefit assessment and how do they manage these kinds of issues in practice. So kind of to give an overview of kind of the ground we've covered so far, I hope that it's become quite apparent that kids need regular and repeated opportunities for outdoor play with its risks, that life itself is full of risks and uncertainty. They're everywhere, and they bring our greatest challenges and joy. And kids need to be kind of provided with the opportunity to experience these things, as well as given the opportunity to develop the skills to manage them on their own. That we have 3 key ingredients for outdoor and risky play supportive environments. So we need to provide the time, the space, and the freedom for this kind of play to happen. And that it will take collective action and cooperation amongst different sectors. But I've been incredibly encouraged by how much movement and momentum has been around this issue already. And people have been able to do some very incredible things with very few resources. So where do you start? So I just want you to spend some time really now and today thinking about what is that first step that you're going to take. It may seem daunting, but you need to think about one first step that is manageable and reasonable that you can actually do to kind of start you on this journey, so that you can feel what you're capable of and the success that you can experience. I would encourage you to go have a look at the Outdoor Play Canada website. A lot of the resources I mentioned and others are listed here, so you can join to get kind of updates on anything that's happening. There is also news around the conference that's upcoming at the end of September, which will be in Ottawa at the Canada Forest and Nature School. And so you can kind of get plugged into kind of that whole movement. If you're not aware, The Nature of Things earlier this year released this documentary on the power of play, which was really beautifully done, you know, stemming from animals and all the way into children. And it was really quite interesting because they talked about the risk and risky play and risk taking and how that plays out for different species, as well as for children. In terms of the research summaries, you can see the one in the CPHA toolkit. As well, just a few weeks ago, we released this chapter in the Child Encyclopedia. So you can get kind of a bite-sized bits of research on the importance of outdoor play, as well as kind of a bit, you know, a bit longer papers from experts and other resources and so on. I wrote some lay articles for the conversation. So this one in particular is about risk and risky play. And then this one is about outdoor play more generally and covers, you know, broader ground. So I would encourage you to you know, figure out what's your why. There's lots of reasons that we should be encouraging, you know, this kind of play and supporting these experiences for our kids. And it, you know, I just want you to think about what is it that would give you the passion to move forward in this work, that would make it, you know, important for you to be part of the momentum that makes these opportunities possible for kids. And so I just want to share my contact information. Feel free to get in touch. Have a look at our website. We have lots of material on there, and our latest research, research studies, etc. And it's actually quite helpful for me to hear from you because our research really needs to be responsive to your needs. It's quite useless without that. And so feel free to please, you know, do get in touch. So I'll stop there and take any further thoughts or questions or anything else. Okay, so feel free to email me with any thoughts or questions as you have them. I look forward to hearing from you. And thanks, TJ, for inviting me to be part of this.
Thank you very much, Mariana. It was a fantastic presentation. On behalf of our partners, Saskatchewan in Motion and the Saskatchewan Association of Recreation Professionals, we certainly appreciate you getting up early this morning and sharing your knowledge with our audience. I know I've picked up a couple nuggets of info I plan on using within our messaging as we advocate on behalf of our profession and the risky play movement. I see there's a couple comments coming in here in the chat. From Lynn, love this area. Thanks for all your support to Canadians in this area. Together we will make a change. Peggy Lynn, thank you so much. Are you seeing all these, Mariana?
I am, yeah. So do you find people, parents in particular, are still averse to the word risky? Yeah, actually, let's talk about that for a moment, because I get that a lot in terms of why use the word risky. So in the CPHA toolkit, it doesn't actually use the word risky play. It uses unstructured outdoor play. And so in terms of my own work, I find it important to use the words risky because when you talk about kind of supporting outdoor play, it's easy for people to get behind that. Yeah, of course, play is important. Yeah, kids should be able to play outside. But then, you know, when it comes to them, say, all of a sudden trying something risky, then it's like, oh, yeah, but not that kind of play. So I feel like, you know, it's my role as kind of an academic and someone who's kind of talking to the cultural side of society to be able to address that word risk head on, to separate it from danger and hazard, and to open up our minds around what kids can do. But I also recognize that people are working with parents and other providers, and you need to meet people where they are. And so if you're in your practice, you need to use the word play or outdoor play, that's fine. You know, you start there and you kind of move it forward. So thanks for that question. That's a great question. And so then tip, Active for Life partner with Dr. C to produce a podcast. Yeah, we're going to have a podcast, Active for Life. Thank you, Lynn, for letting everybody know. We're sharing lots of parent-friendly resources and articles to help you message to parents and colleagues. Find us at activeforlife.com. Great. Thank you, Lynn. Yes. So I look forward to that podcast coming out, and I'll be certainly putting it on my social media channels when it's available. Any other thoughts or comments? Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you again, Mariana. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks, TJ. Bye.